So now let's move forward and talk about React forms. Okay, so React forms, just like in HTML, you can very easily create forms within React, and React allows you to interact with them. How do we add forms to React? Well, you add a form with React just like any other element. So what do we do is we create our component. So we have a function, my form. We create a just ordinary component, bracket start, bracket close. Then we give a return statement. As we have already talked, you need a return statement in a component. Then round bracket starts, round bracket close. Then we create a form tag. This is a simple HTML tag. Again, keeping in the rule that we have a one parent tag. Each parent tag contains just child nodes. Now form tag is there. Of course, this is just a basic tag. It doesn't contain many other things, but you can add as many things or as a normal form as you like. Everything is allowed here. Once you create a form, then you render the form on your screen. Okay. Now W3Schools uses React DOM create ROM in this method. I have already shown you the VS Code or the full approach how you can render your components using a normal React project if you create it in VS Code. Okay, this is just like an online version or web version of how you do it, just slightly different. Okay. Anyway, so this is typically how we create a form, just like any other things. So this will work as a normal. The form will submit the page and it will refresh. But this is generally not what we exactly want to happen. So once you create it, and if you run the code, you will see that there is a form and it will just refresh the page. What we want is we want the data to be processed as well. So we want to prevent this default behavior and we want the React to take control of the form. How do we do that? That's where the React trick comes into play. So handling a form is about how you handle the data when it changes the value or gets submitted. In HTML, form data is usually handled by the DOM. Okay, so all the form data is handled through the DOM with respect to HTML. But when you talk about in terms of React, the form data is usually handled by the components. So this is where you need to change slightly the behavior of how the React is working. By default, HTML and JavaScript tends to handle it with respect to document object model. But when you're talking about the React, you want the component that you have created to handle the form data. So when the data is handled by the component, all data is stored in the component's current state. Okay, so you can control the change and you can control changes by adding event handlers on the on change event attributes. So we can use the state hook to keep track of each input values and provide a single source of truth for an entire application. Understand? So we will be using components to control the events, controlling the form. We can use on change attributes to the event handlers, and we will actually use the use state hook to keep track of each input that the user is doing. That's how basically we try to work with the forms. Now, for example, how do we use the use state as a very good example of how things are working? The first thing is we import the use state from the React library. Then we use React DOM. Again, we have already talked about this from the React library called React DOM/client. Then we create our component form my form. We define a constant state. So we say, hey, I have a name. Set that name is equals to use state currently blank. So once that state is defined, we define use a return statement, bracket starts. The form is defined here. Now the key thing here is that we define a form, we give it a label, we give it an input type, which is again text. The value is again an expression here. So bracket start, bracket close. The value is actually an expression that we want to control. So whatever name user enters, we want to process that as a current value. And then we give it an on change event. So when an event occurs, means something is being changed. Again, we wrote another expression that creates this state behavior and then manages that state behavior. So how does it do that? Again, we have an expression. We use this current event object, use the current event that's being triggered, set name, which is again this variable name, this current event dot target, which is currently this target area, events that been triggered and the value of that event. So basically what's happening here is we are using the component to control the event and we are using a state to hold the current change. Okay, so three things are actually happening here. First, components are handling the event. Second, we are triggering an event. Third, what we are doing is we are using our use state hook to maintain what event and what values are being changed. Understand that? So to do that, again, this is a standard state hook that we create. We give it a variable name and a set name. Inside our input forms, we use this on change event. We create an expression. The syntax of it is that within the brackets, we use this E, which means the current event. Event means anything user does an input on. So anything user is trying to change, that's an event. So whether user is moving a mouse, hovering a mouse, clicking on a button, pressing a key, anything user does is actually an event. So here what we're doing is on change event, we are triggering that on this text field, when something is changing, means the text itself is changing, event is triggered. That event calls through this arrow function a set name variable, which is actually our current state. So current state is just like a current bucket that holds the information about what data is being changed or what is being happening, the current state of your text field. Okay, so it's like a bucket. Okay, so then within this bucket we are saying, hey, there's an event change, find out the target, which is actually this input text field. So we are saying, hey, find out the current target on which the event has triggered, and then get the value of that current target. So whatever value user is entering in the text field will actually be saved in this set name current state bucket. Make a little bit of sense? That's how basically we try to manage things. Okay, so this is how it's basically trying to work with that. Now what happens when we submit the form? Because this again becomes a key thing, that when I click on a button, the form data should be submitted. So you can control the submit action by adding an event handler on the on submit attribute in your form. So we know that we have an on submit event inside the event inside the forms in React. So to enable, in order to enable that submit button, we apply an event on that. Previously we used an on change. Now we are trying to target on submit attribute. So what we do now in this case is that we create an on submit button and add an event listener to this. So to do that, again the same philosophy follows. We use a state to ensure that whatever change is being occurred, we save it inside our current state. We call the React DOM. We create a component called myForm. Inside it, we create the state variable constant name set name is equals to use state currently blank. No data is provided inside it. So we have a state variable declared. In other words, a bucket has been created where we can save the current latest information, what's happening here. Then we create constant handle submit. Okay, event and arrow function has been created here. So we declare an arrow function here and we say event bracket start bracket close, event prevent the default behavior and generate an alert if that is being there. The name you entered was this thing. So we are telling it that, hey, do not use the default behavior, which basically means auto reload the web page and submit the data to the React component. By default, it will again submit it to the HTML DOM. So using this, we are preventing the default behavior. Then we are generating and printing the name, that whatever the event is triggered, use this submit information, and whatever name was entered, print that on the screen. So we say, hey, return form data on submit event handle submit. So this basically means that we've created a form and we given a form and on submit event. And we said that when this event is triggered, call this arrow function handle submit. So this function has been called here handle submit. When this function is called, it will trigger an event, or it takes this event as an argument, arrow function sign bracket start bracket close. It will prevent the default behavior, which is again submitting the data to the DOM. It will then just simply use the alert, print your name on it. So whatever name you entered here inside the text field's value will actually be read here and printed on this. Capish? Perfect. Okay. And then the rest is actually exactly same. So we have text type, we have value, we have an on change, we call an event, and then we say set name e target value. So set the current value to the bucket value to this whatever value user has entered here. Take this value, and when clicks submit button, just print the name as an alert message box. This is how we handle the command. Becomes very simple, very easy. We'll try to do a few more examples later on, and then it can be much easier to follow. Now, what happens, because again, if we are creating a form, there is usually not one single value. There are multiple values inside the forms. So you can control the values of more than one input field by adding a name attribute to each element. We will initialize our state with an empty object. Okay, so initially we use an empty object to do that, but to access the fields in event handlers, we use event.trigger target.name and event.target.value syntax. Okay, so in order to access each fields of different input types, we use event target name and event target value syntax. To update the state, use the square bracket notation around the property name. Okay, so let me explain this in terms of code, what exactly we mean by that. So when you come here, Now what's happening here is that, again, same thing. We have a state. We now have a handle change event. Event is triggered. Arrow function is called. Same example. This time we have constant name, event target dot name, constant value, event dot target value. So for example, you can have three text fields inside it. Okay, and so you have a three text fields inside your component. What we're trying to do is that we are trying to find out that no matter which text field user enters the data, the event will be triggered on that. So once the event is triggered on any text field, read the text field data based on the event, find out the target and get its name. Through this syntax, we are very easily able to use these three lines and control the event handling on multiple input fields. So if you have 3 input fields, or you could have 10 input fields, you can control event by using just these 4 lines. Because here we are saying, hey, event has been triggered, find out the target on which, or text field on which the event was triggered, and then get me its name. Then we say, hey, find out the event has been triggered, find out the target, and get the value of that event. So whichever text field you have entered, find out the value. Then we can say set inputs value, declared another function, and then we use its values and names using the square brackets. Okay, so we are now printing this information here. We go in handle submit button. This is again handle change. Then we have a handle submit button, again preventing the default, and now we are printing the inputs, which again is a bucket from our state. Okay, so the state hook has been called. The bucket was filled. Whenever data is there, we input the values into our bucket, and then we call that input values and print that. Okay, so set inputs is like a bucket. We use inputs to read the data from that bucket. So we're saying, hey, put all the values inside the bucket and then print whatever is inside the bucket here. Finally, we return the form. On submit, we call the handle submit button, which will actually call this function here. Then we say input name, enter text name, value. This time, this is not just a simple value. This time what we're doing is we are telling it that go inside the input dot username. So this username actually becomes the target name. So the target is actually inputs. The name is actually the username. Or if it's blank, leave it to the blank value. On change handle event. So what this is now doing is this is controlling the input types value 1. So if you scroll down, now we have a second input type here. This again, so instead of just using the value in previous as per compared to previous examples, we are actually giving it the target dot its name. So the name is H. In this case, the name is username. So we are providing it the separate name that we want to provide it with. And then this name is actually going to be used here. Event target dot name. Whatever the name of the target is, read that name. Whatever the value of that target is, read the value. So based on the target, we are determining which values we are reading. Okay. So it's again same as using class ID or class ID or just simple ID attributes. So when we use that, we use the class name dot the name of the component. Here what we are doing is we are just using simply the name of the input type. So we are saying, hey, I'm going inside the input and then use the username. This allows us to read the data. So we use the same event handler function for both input fields. We could write one event handler for each, but this gives us much cleaner code and is preferred a way of React. So event handler is just the one event handler that allows us to handle event of all the input types. Right? So this is much preferred and cleaner way of doing it inside the React. Now moving on further, what about the text area? The text area element in the React is slightly different from our ordinary HTML. In HTML, the value of text area was the text between the start tag, text area, and the end tag, text area. Okay. So what we'd say is that inside our HTML, this becomes my text area. So in React, the value of text area is placed in a value attribute. We will use state hook to manage the value of this text area. How do we do that? Again, we use this use state hook to do that. So we create a component called myForm. We define a constant text area and set text area state, and then we define certain text information here. Previously, when we used the user state, this was blank. This time we have already given it the default text here. Again, an event handler has been created that handles an event and then whatever information we want to do. So in this case, we are setting the bucket text or using the state to hold the current value of a text area, which is that event has been triggered. find out which target it was and read its value. Then return form text area. The value again is text area itself, which is again the target name. On change, we call the handle event. Simple as that. Okay, so almost similar, a simple text area with some content which will be printed and read by the system. Okay, now the select statements. Again, this is very common thing when you have a multiple options within your form tag. How do we read and process that? So a drop down list or a select box in React is also a bit different from HTML. In HTML, the select value in the drop down list was defined with the selected attribute. For example, we use the select attribute, options value, options value, options value. So whichever value is currently selected, we use the selected attribute to do that. So this selected attribute determines that out of these three options, I have selected this thing. In the React, the selected value is defined with the value attribute on the select tag. Okay, so in the React, it's slightly different. So it is a selected attribute, but this time what we're doing is that in React, the selected value is defined with the value, not just the selected tag on the select attribute. So what will be happening here is that if you come inside the form, you will see a select. There is no selected attribute here. Okay, there's no selected attribute here. In React, it doesn't need that. In React, it needs a value attribute on a select tag. So if you go inside the main select tag, it needs value is equals to my car, which again on change handles the event. Okay, so this basically means that I'm using the my car attribute to determine which tag is supposed to be selected. Okay, so which tag is going to be selected, I need to define that my car here. What is my car? Again, my car is your state, the current state, and the bucket set my car value is here. Use state default is going to be Volvo. So actually we are putting the information that which tag by default is which option is by default selected. We're putting this in our state information, and when the React loads your page, it reads this information from your state hook or your bucket, and then this select actually enables that. Okay, so with the value tag and my car is actually coming from this my car attribute. This value of this is again set my car, which by default is Volvo. So it's going to go and read this Volvo value and by default enable this. That's how it tries to read it. Okay, and then if you change it, so any event occurs on change, this change will trigger this event and my car value will automatically be changed. So now we are changing this bucket variable from go trigger the event, find out the target, which again will be this select, and then whatever value we have changed here. So instead of using the selected tag, we actually use this value tag to trigger it. So the way again this works is that when the program loads, we put the information inside our state for that component, that which tag is supposed to be selected. We put that information in our state, and we use this state variable to determine in our selected tag that hey, which option I want to do that. A little bit tricky way, but that's how the standard React works. So making these slight changes to text area and select, React is able to handle all the inputs and the elements in the same way. Okay, wonderful. Now after that, we're going to discuss something called router, which is one of the most important aspects in React that you need to understand, where you want to link multiple web pages together.